Hello there, welcome to Danny Night Stories. I'm here to help you relax whether you are sleeping or just want to rest. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Now relax and enjoy. Minecraft Horror Story: The Fog That Destroys. Chapter 1: A Road Made of Lanterns. Steve had been walking east since sunrise, following an old cobblestone road that appeared and disappeared beneath the grass. He gathered sweet berries, cooked 2 salmon beside a river, and moved on beneath the square sun without any hurry. He had spent 47 days living in a sandstone shelter beside a ruined portal. It was useful, but never comfortable. Steve wanted oak beams, a wheat field, and rain on a proper roof, so he packed his best tools and followed the road toward greener land. By late afternoon, he reached a broad lake surrounded by birch and dark oak. A small village stood on the northern shore. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. Villagers worked among overgrown farms, and an iron golem waited beside the bell. Steve decided to stay. As he climbed the low hill above the water, one clear whistle drifted from the dark oak forest. Steve glanced across the lake, saw nothing among the trees, and continued walking. He assumed a shepherd had wandered beyond the village. He chose a low hill overlooking the water and marked out a house with oak logs. The first wall faced the sunrise. The second held a wide window toward the village. He used stone brick around the foundation, built a chimney above the furnace, and placed his red bed beneath a shelf of maps. By the time the square sun touched the treetops, he had finished the roof and hung 3 lanterns along the path. The final lantern went on a fence post at the edge of the lake. Its warm light spread over the reeds and turned the nearest water blocks gold. Steve stood there for a while, pleased by the simple sight of it. Then a message appeared in the lower corner of his vision. Mason joined the game. Seconds later, another figure came running along the old road, wearing enchanted boots and carrying far too many shulker boxes. Mason had shared the world with Steve since its first day. He was a careful builder, a patient miner, and a redstone engineer whose machines often worked on the 3rd attempt. He stopped at the top of the hill and looked from the new house to the lake. "You finally chose somewhere with rain," he said. "And trees," Steve replied. "An ambitious luxury." They spent the rest of the evening improving the place. Mason built a small dock, while Steve fenced a patch of soil for carrots and wheat. They moved 2 cows into a pen, repaired the village path, and placed torches wherever shadows gathered. Nothing chased them. Nothing watched them. The first stars appeared over an ordinary Minecraft world, clean and bright between slow-moving clouds. That calm first evening lasted less than a minute in memory, although Steve would later wish it had lasted much longer. When he opened his inventory to put away the remaining supplies, he found an item he had never collected. It looked like a dark rectangle with 2 pale circles on its face. The label read, "Cassette 1, Safety Instructions." Steve moved it from one slot to another. He checked the floor for a dropped item and looked through the open door, expecting Mason to be standing outside with some explanation. Mason was still at the dock, arranging oak slabs. "Did you give me a cassette?" Steve asked. "A what?" Steve carried it outside. Mason inspected the item, turned it over in his hand, and gave it back. "It must have come from the village," Mason said. "I did not open any village chests." Then it came with an advancement. There was no advancement. Mason looked toward the village. The iron golem passed slowly between 2 houses. The bell remained still. Beyond the roofs, pale mist had started to collect between the dark oak trunks. "We need a recorder to play it," Mason said. "Until then, it is only suspicious decoration." He placed the cassette on the shelf above Steve's bed. The two players slept before the moon had climbed high. Morning came with soft rain. Steve spent the second day planting wheat and rebuilding the nearest village house. Mason dug a staircase into the hill and lined it with stone brick, planning a storage room below the house. They traded coal for emeralds, gathered eggs, and found a grey cat hiding beneath a composter. Near midday, Steve visited the librarian. The villager's house contained an ordinary lectern, 3 bookshelves, and a chest holding paper. Yet the librarian would not look at Steve. He stood at the eastern window and stared across the lake toward the dark oak forest. Steve moved in front of him. The villager stepped sideways to keep the same view. The farmer did the same. So did the cartographer and the toolsmith. Every villager in the settlement had stopped working. Even the iron golem faced the far shore, red eyes fixed on the place where pale mist gathered beneath the trees. Mason rang the village bell. The villagers ran into their houses, but they chose windows that faced the forest. When the bell stopped, they remained there. "They can see something," Steve said. Mason stood beside the golem, or their pathfinding is broken. The grey cat came out from beneath the composter. It followed Steve up the hill, entered the new house, and jumped onto the furnace. Steve used one of the name tags Mason had carried to call it Furnace. The cat settled on the warm block and closed its eyes. For the remainder of the afternoon, it was the only creature in the village that did not watch the opposite shore. Steve tried to treat the villagers' behavior as an error. He harvested sugar cane, crafted paper, and expanded the wall map above his bed. The new map showed the lake, the village, and the dark forest. At the center of that forest stood a single black pixel that did not match any block Steve knew. He removed the map and placed it again. The pixel moved 1 square closer to the lake. Steve rolled up the map and put it inside a chest. Nothing unusual happened until sunset. Steve was on the roof, fitting oak stairs around the chimney, when he heard someone whistle. It was a low, descending note from the dark oak forest across the lake. He looked toward Mason, but Mason was in the field below, harvesting wheat with his back turned. The whistle came again. This time it was farther to the left. Steve crossed the roof and stared past the birch trunks. Rain made thin blue lines across the world. The dark forest beyond them appeared almost solid, a wall of leaves and shadow. He saw no player name, no pillager banner, and no wandering trader. "Did you hear that?" he called. Mason looked up. "Hear what?" Lightning flashed behind the forest. There was no thunder for a single white frame. The trees became sharp black shapes against the sky, and a tall figure stood between them. It was too narrow to be an Enderman, and too still to be a skeleton. Its body was black from its square head to the ends of its long arms. 2 white eyes shone above a mouth made of vertical red and white bars. It stood at the limit of the render distance, where the rain and fog softened the blocks around it. Steve kept his crosshair on the figure. "Mason," he said, "quieter now, across the lake, between the 2 dark oaks." Mason climbed onto the fence, following Steve's gaze. "I see it." The figure did not walk, it did not sway. The rain passed through the darkness around its limbs, as though those limbs occupied a space the weather could not enter. Mason drew his bow. "Do not shoot yet," Steve said. "Why?" Steve had no answer. A certainty had settled over him the moment he saw the white eyes. Looking away felt dangerous. Mason loosed an arrow. It crossed the lake, dipped beneath the leaves, and struck the tree beside the figure. The black shape vanished. There was no cloud of particles, no death sound. One frame contained the creature, and the next contained only wet grass. Mason lowered the bow. Probably a modded mob. Which mod? We have installed too many. They searched the forest before night fully arrived. Steve found Mason's arrow embedded in dark oak, but there were no footprints, dropped items, or damaged leaves. The grass beneath the tree was ordinary. Only the fog seemed unusual. It hung in pale square layers close to the ground, even though the rain had stopped. They returned to the house and locked the oak door. Mason placed 2 additional torches outside. Steve moved the cassette from the shelf into a chest. Neither of them mentioned the figure while they smelted iron and sorted wood. The silence between them was not fear yet. It was the private calculation players made when they encountered something they did not understand. Before sleeping, Steve checked every window. The village was quiet. Moonlight lay across the farms. The iron golem stood beside the bell, facing the road. Steve clicked the bed. A message appeared above his hotbar. "You cannot sleep while he is near." He stepped back. Mason tried his own bed. The same message appeared. They looked through the eastern window, then the western one. They checked the roof and the storage room outside. The lake reflected the moon in a silver path. Nothing moved among the trees. The whistle came from directly beneath the floor. Mason drew his sword. Steve opened the trapdoor to the unfinished storage staircase. Torchlight reached 10 steps down and ended at a stone wall. There was no room beneath it yet, only the short passage Mason had dug that morning. At the bottom of the steps, 2 white squares opened in the darkness. Steve slammed the trapdoor. Something struck it from below. The wooden panel jumped in its frame. Mason placed a stone block over it, then another. The impact stopped. For several seconds they listened. The whistle sounded outside again, back across the lake. They hurried to the window. The man stood on the opposite shore, exactly where Steve had first seen him. His arms hung below his knees. His white eyes stared into the house. The red bars of his mouth seemed brighter than before. "Keep looking at him," Steve said. "Why?" Mason asked again. "Because when we looked away, he came closer." They watched through the glass while the moon traveled slowly over the lake. Every few minutes Mason backed toward a chest for food, never turning his head. Steve held the creature in the center of his view. The man did nothing. Near midnight, a zombie groaned outside the fence. Steve glanced left as it approached the wheat field. The man vanished. Mason turned to check the rear window. The creature was standing at the end of their lantern path. It had crossed more than 100 blocks without making a sound. Steve looked straight at it. It became still once more. 30 seconds, Mason murmured. "What?" "I started counting when you looked at the zombie. It took about 30 seconds to move." The man tilted his head. The movement was slow and almost curious. Then he vanished again. A violent burst of white noise filled the house. Every torch dimmed at once. Darkness covered Steve's vision for 2 heartbeats. When his sight returned, long black fingers were curled over the top edge of the window. The man was clinging to the outside wall. His face hung upside down against the glass. Chapter 2: The Eyes Between the Trees. Mason swung first. His iron sword struck the glass instead of the creature. The pane shattered outward, and cold fog spilled into the room. The man dropped from sight. Steve placed an oak plank over the opening. Before he could add a second block, something scraped across the roof, with the dry rhythm of bones dragged over stone. They moved to opposite corners, weapons raised. The scraping traveled above the beds, crossed the chimney, and stopped over the trapdoor. Fine grey particles drifted from the ceiling. "It can climb," Mason whispered. The oak door exploded inward. The creature entered bent almost double, its shoulders passing through the frame before its long body unfolded inside the room. Its eyes were no longer white, they burned red, and the bars of its mouth opened much farther than the square head should have allowed. Steve hit it with his diamond pickaxe. Mason struck with the sword. The blows produced no familiar damage flash. The man lunged, knocked Mason across the room, and turned towards Steve with a speed that made its limbs blur. Steve jumped through the broken window. He landed outside with 3 hearts missing, vaulted the fence, and ran toward the village. Behind him, more glass shattered. Mason followed, eating cooked beef as he sprinted. The village bell began ringing. No villager was pulling it. The iron golem marched toward the house. The man came over the roof on all 4s, clinging to the oak stairs like a black spider. It dropped in front of the golem. One long arm moved. The golem flew backward into the lake, taking damage before it had a chance to swing. Steve and Mason reached the nearest stone house. Mason held the door while Steve blocked the windows with cobblestone. They heard the man strike the iron golem again outside. Water splashed. The bell rang faster. Then every sound stopped. Steve waited with the pickaxe raised. The darkness effect faded from the corners of his view. His hearts began to recover. Mason looked through a 1-block opening beside the roof. "It is gone." "For how long?" "I do not know." They remained in the stone house until dawn. Villagers crowded into the back corner, shaking their heads and making anxious murmurs. At sunrise, Steve broke the block from the window. The hilltop house had lost its door and most of its glass. Several roof blocks were missing. Deep scratches crossed the outer logs, not as a texture, but as places where entire cubes had been removed. The iron golem stood waist-deep in the lake with cracks across its body. Fog covered the far shore. Mason opened the chat log and scrolled through the night's messages. No mob name had appeared. There had been no advancement when they saw it, and no damage message when they hit it. Only the warning remained. "You cannot sleep while he is near." They spent the morning rebuilding with stone. Oak walls became stone brick. The broad window became a narrow slit. Mason designed iron pistons to seal the entrances, and Steve dug an escape tunnel from the storage room to the lakeshore. Neither player suggested leaving. Their best equipment was here. Their crops were established, and the village offered trades they still needed. More importantly, abandoning the hill would not answer what had found them. At noon, they discovered the cassette chest standing open. The cassette was gone. Mason checked every inventory. Steve searched beneath the beds and behind the furnaces. The item had disappeared without either of them touching it. They found it outside on the lantern path. It lay exactly where the man had stood. Steve approached with his shield raised. The dark rectangle rotated slowly above the grass. When he picked it up, a sound played from no visible source, a short click, followed by a man taking a breath. Then silence. Mason built an observation post before they went searching. He placed an armor stand at the end of the lantern path, gave it a carved pumpkin, and fitted a spyglass into a frame inside the house. Beside the window, he made a clock from hoppers and redstone comparators. Every lamp in the line represented 10 seconds. If looking delays it, he said, we should know exactly how long looking away gives it. Steve disliked using their home as a test, but he helped. They waited until the man appeared between two birch trees on the far shore. Mason kept the spyglass fixed on him while Steve watched the clock. Nothing changed for almost 5 minutes. Then Mason lowered the spyglass. 1 lamp, 2, 3. At the moment, the third lamp lit. Fake lightning flashed. The man appeared beside the armor stand. Mason raised the spyglass again. The figure became still. 30 seconds, he said. Exactly. Steve looked at the carved pumpkin beside the creature. What happens after that? They let the clock continue while neither player looked directly through the window. The 4th lamp lit. Half of the 5th lit. The armor stand broke. Darkness covered the room. The whistle began outside. Steve and Mason turned together. The lantern path was empty. The carved pumpkin lay on the grass, but the armor stand had vanished. The man did not attack. After 50 seconds, silent lightning flashed beyond the village, and the darkness lifted. Mason reset the clock with shaking hands. Watching, he said, closing in, chasing. Steve added 3 labels beneath the lamps. Those are not stages of an ordinary mob. No, Mason replied. They are stages of a decision. When they checked the carved pumpkin, vertical red and white lines had appeared across its face. We need the recorder, Steve said. The village cartographer sold them a woodland map, but it showed a mansion thousands of blocks away. The cleric offered glowstone. The librarian sold bookshelves. No one had a recorder, and no ordinary crafting recipe produced one. Mason searched the surrounding chunks, while Steve gathered obsidian and food. They divided the land into directions. Mason took the plains east of the old road. Steve followed the forest north. The calm of daylight returned just enough to feel false. Sunlight fell in scattered squares through the birch leaves. Pigs wandered between ferns. Steve crossed a shallow stream and climbed a slope covered in cornflowers. He kept turning to check behind him, but the man did not appear. After several hundred blocks, the forest changed. Birch gave way to dark oak, and the canopy closed overhead. Mushrooms grew in the shade. The ground rose and fell in short ridges that blocked Steve's view. He placed torches as markers and continued north. The first strange thing he found was an oak door standing alone between 2 trees. It had no wall, roof, or foundation. When Steve opened it, the door revealed the same forest on the other side. He broke it and collected the item. 20 blocks farther on, he found a glass pane floating above the grass. Then a fence post. Then the red bed from his house. The bed lay beneath a dark oak tree. Although Steve knew he had left it on the hill, he did not touch it. Mason, he said into voice chat, are you at the base? No, I found something in the plains. What? A house. It is not a village house. It has no windows. Steve looked at the bed under the tree. Above it, a black figure hung upside down from the leaves. Its arms dangled on either side of Steve's red pillow. Its white eyes were closed. The barred mouth formed a rigid line. Steve stepped backward without moving his crosshair. The hanging man remained motionless. "Do not go inside," Steve told Mason. "I already did." "Get out. There is a villager here, different clothes, and a chest." The eyes above the bed opened. Steve ran. Branches whipped across his view. He jumped over mushrooms, followed his torch markers, and heard leaves breaking behind him. The creature did not whistle. It crawled through the canopy, keeping pace without touching the ground. "Mason, can you hear me?" White noise answered through the voice channel. Steve reached the birch forest and looked back. Nothing crossed the border between the biomes. Dark fog filled the spaces under the oak canopy, pale at the top and almost black near the roots. His voice connection returned. "Steve," Mason said, "where did you go?" "I am coming to you. Send coordinates." Mason read them out. The house lay almost 900 blocks southeast. Steve traveled through the afternoon, keeping to open ground. When he finally saw Mason, the square sun was low. Mason stood outside a narrow structure made of stripped dark oak and deep slate. There were no windows. A crooked chimney rose above the roof, but no smoke came from it. Beside the entrance stood a villager in a black robe. A pale symbol had been stitched over its chest, 2 square eyes above a row of vertical lines. The villager offered no ordinary trade. When Steve interacted with him, a single item appeared in the final slot. Cassette recorder, 8 emeralds. The chest had these, Mason said. He showed Steve a glass bottle, 2 cobwebs, a book, a potion of strong healing, and a small dark blue item shaped like a droplet. Its label read, "Tear of the Man." Steve looked at the robed villager. It stared at the western horizon. "Did you take anything else?" "Only those." "Put the tear back. We may need it." "For what?" Mason looked at the cassette in Steve's hand. "For the instructions." They traded coal with farmers in the village until they had 8 emeralds, then returned before dark. The robed villager accepted the emeralds and handed over a recorder. It was a squat black block with a narrow slot on top and a red button on one side. Steve placed it inside the house. The single room contained a table, a bed, and 4 unlit candles. Scratches covered the deep slate floor in circles around the center. Mason lit the candles. Steve inserted the cassette. The wheels inside began to turn. Static filled the room. A weary voice emerged from the recorder. "If you are hearing this, he has already seen you." Mason closed the door. "Do not run at the first sighting. Do not hide and assume he is gone. Keep him in view for as long as you can. When you ignore him, he crosses the distance. When you hear the whistle, find him before the final note." The tape hissed. "A wooden door is not shelter. Glass is not shelter. Height is not shelter. He climbs. Water is not shelter. He swims. If sleep refuses you, do not keep trying. He is close enough to watch the bed." Something tapped on the roof. Steve looked up. One of the candles went out. The voice on the cassette continued. "The first shape watches. The second hangs above the path. The third hunts. If his eyes turn red, you have waited too long. Another candle went out. Mason drew his sword. The fog is not weather. It belongs to him. Do not enter it. Do not let it touch your chests, your maps, or your spawn. The fog does not cover things. The third candle died. The voice dropped to a whisper. The fog removes them. The recorder clicked off. The last candle went dark. From outside came a long descending whistle. Chapter 3: The House Without Windows. Steve and Mason stood on either side of the door, listening as the whistle faded through the fields. Neither opened it. The robed villager murmured outside. Soft footsteps crossed the grass, paused near the wall, then moved away. Steve held his shield toward the entrance. Mason placed a deep slate block behind them, sealing the room more completely. The whistle began again. This time the final note did not end. It stretched into a thin electronic tone from the cassette recorder. The red button pressed itself. The reels turned, although Steve had removed the tape. Static rose. Beneath it, the recorded voice repeated a sentence backward. Mason broke the recorder with his pickaxe. The block dropped to the floor, and the sound stopped. Something heavy landed on the roof. Dust fell from the beams. A section of dark oak vanished, leaving a square opening to the night sky. Long fingers curled around its edge. Steve placed cobblestone into the hole. The block broke immediately. A black arm pushed through and swept across the ceiling, searching. "Tunnel," Mason said. They dug into the deep slate floor. Steve worked downward while Mason replaced the blocks above them. After 6 blocks, the floor opened into a natural cave. They dropped onto pointed dripstone and extinguished the torch behind them. The creature struck the sealed shaft. Deep slate cracked overhead. Steve and Mason ran into the cave. They moved by the weak light of redstone ore, careful of sudden drops. Water flowed from a wall and disappeared into a lower chamber. Steve placed torches only when the darkness became complete, then broke them after Mason passed. The impacts above faded. For a while, the cave contained only normal dangers. A skeleton fired from behind a stalagmite. Mason blocked the arrow, and Steve knocked the mob into the water. 2 zombies climbed from a side tunnel. They dealt with them quickly, relieved by enemies that obeyed familiar rules. They reached an abandoned mine shaft 20 blocks below the surface. Oak supports divided the passage into repeating frames. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and rails led both directions into darkness. Mason placed the recorder on a minecart. "Why are you bringing it?" Steve asked. The first tape knew more than we did. It also turned itself on. That means it works. Steve stared at him. Poor choice of words, Mason admitted. They followed the rails north. The mine shaft descended gradually, crossing ravines and small caves. At one intersection they found a chest minecart containing bread, iron, and another cassette. Cassette 3, The Distance. There was no second cassette. Mason inserted the tape into the recorder. The voice was not the same person from the safety instructions. This speaker sounded younger and out of breath. I counted the blocks, 200 from the first tree to the bunker. It did not matter. He followed. I crossed the river. It did not matter. I towered up 30 blocks. He climbed. I hid under stone, and that was worse, because when he could not see me, he started breaking everything between us. Wood creaked behind them. Steve turned. The passage was empty. The tape continued. You can tell when he is looking for you. He stops making sounds. No whistle, no steps. The blocks simply begin disappearing. One of the mine shaft supports vanished. Gravel poured from the ceiling. Mason grabbed the recorder. They ran as the tunnel collapsed behind them. Gravel filled the rails and pushed through the webs. Steve reached a side passage, but Mason shouted for him to keep moving. He wants us out of sight, Mason said. That is when he changes. The side passage ended at a cramped refuge made from mismatched blocks. Someone had sealed an old section of mine shaft with stone brick, dirt, and iron ore, whatever had been close enough to place in a hurry. 2 empty bowls sat on a crafting table. A torch burned above a bed, though the blanket was covered in dust. 4 signs had been fixed to the wall. The first read, "If you see the eyes, keep them above your crosshair." The second read, "If he vanishes, count to 30. The third read, "If the whistle ends, run before the darkness starts." The 4th sign was blank. Mason opened the chest beneath them. Inside were 46 broken stone pickaxes, each with 1 point of durability left. No player would normally save tools in that condition. Steve picked up the nearest pickaxe. Its custom name appeared over his hotbar. Day 1. The next was Day 2. The next Day 3. At the bottom of the chest, the labels changed. Night 1, Night 2, Night 2 again. The final pickaxe was called I Cannot Reach Morning. Mason looked at the dusty bed. Someone kept mining because the game would not let them sleep. The torch above the bed went out. Words appeared on the blank 4th sign, 1 letter at a time. He is reading with you. Steve turned toward the entrance. The man filled the passage beyond the refuge. Only his white eyes were visible. Steve held the crosshair on them. Mason broke through the back wall and found another rail tunnel. He cleared a path wide enough for Steve to follow, then placed a torch as a guide. Steve backed away from the refuge. The man did not move. When the stone wall finally blocked the creature from view, Steve began counting. At 29, fake lightning flashed through solid rock. At 30, the whistle began. They entered a ravine. Lava glowed at the bottom, and a narrow wooden bridge crossed to the other side. Halfway across, Steve looked up. The man stood on a ledge above them. White eyes followed their movement. His body was partly hidden by fog that poured down the rock like a pale waterfall. Steve stopped. "Keep your crosshair on him," he said. Mason stood behind Steve and built a cobblestone wall along the bridge to stop skeleton arrows. Steve backed across 1 block at a time, never looking away. The man remained on the ledge. Mason reached the far side and opened a tunnel into stone. "Your turn." Steve continued backing up. The distance between him and the creature stayed constant until a bat flew across his view. His crosshair moved for less than a second. The man appeared on the bridge. He was 30 blocks closer, motionless between one frame and the next. Steve raised his shield again. "Dig faster." Mason broke through to another cave. Steve backed toward him. The man's head tilted farther with every step, following Steve at an impossible angle. Then the creature crouched. The white eyes closed. Red light opened behind them. Darkness swallowed the ravine. Steve heard the first sharp note of the whistle and ran. The man crossed the bridge in a blur. Mason placed cobblestone behind them, but the hunter smashed through each block without slowing. Its arms struck the tunnel walls and removed stone in square bursts. The sound was not mining. There was no pickaxe rhythm, only sudden empty spaces where blocks had been. They sprinted through the cave. Steve drank a swiftness potion from Mason's pack. Mason threw splash healing at their feet after the hunter's arm clipped his shoulder. The creature pursued on all fours, crawling through 2-block passages without needing to slow. Its mouth opened and shut around a deep clicking sound. Red and white bars flashed in the darkness. Water appeared ahead. Steve jumped into an underground river and swam with the current. Mason followed. The hunter entered behind them and moved through the water almost as quickly as it had moved on stone. The current swept them down a narrow chute. Steve's air bubbles dropped. He passed beneath a low ceiling, found a pocket of air, and surfaced beside Mason. The hunter's eyes shone underwater below them. Mason placed a door against the wall, creating another air pocket. The creature hit it once. The door broke into an item. They dove again. The river opened into a flooded cave filled with glow squid. Blue light pulsed around stone columns. Steve used the swiftness effect to reach a dry ledge. Mason arrived with only 2 hearts left. The hunter climbed out of the water on the opposite side. Steve drew his bow and fired. The arrow struck its chest. This time the creature flashed red, but it did not stagger. Mason fired a second arrow. The hunter turned toward him. For several seconds, Steve and Mason shot every arrow they had. The creature absorbed them and continued forward. It had more health than anything in the overworld should have carried. Even the iron golem had barely moved it. Mason opened his inventory. I have 1 ender pearl. Use it. What about you? Steve pointed toward a vertical water column descending from the ceiling. I have blocks. Mason threw the pearl through an opening above. He disappeared with a soft crack. The hunter lunged at Steve. Steve placed kelp in the water column, converted it to source blocks, and swam upward. The creature hit the water below. Steve climbed through a twisting shaft, while darkness pressed around the edges of his view. The shaft ended beneath dirt. He dug upward, emerged into rain, and found himself in the plains near the windowless house. The hunter burst from the ground behind him. Mason stood on the roof of the house. Steve, this way. He activated a redstone lever. Pistons pulled the center blocks from a wide pit that Mason had quickly uncovered beside the structure. Steve jumped over the opening. The hunter followed and fell 20 blocks onto pointed dripstone. For the first time, it screamed. The noise shook particles from the grass. A fake lightning flash split the clear sky. Fog surged out of the pit and rolled across the field. Run, Steve said. They ran east, away from the village and their lakeside house. Behind them, the hunter climbed out of the trap. It moved faster than before, but the chase had already lasted close to a minute. As Steve reached the top of a low hill, the creature vanished in another silent flash. No drops remained. No experience orb floated over the pit. Only fog spread through the grass. They waited until dawn before returning to the windowless house. The robed villager was gone. So was the chest, the bed, the table, and every candle. The structure stood empty except for one sign on the far wall. Mason read it aloud. "He follows the one who carries the tear." Steve turned toward him. Mason opened his inventory. The tear of the man was still there. "Put it down," Steve said. Mason dropped the item onto the floor. It did not fall. It hovered for a second, then slid across the room against the slope of the blocks and stopped at Steve's boots. Steve backed away. The tear followed. Mason picked it up again. "It has chosen an owner." Then it chose badly. They tried fire first. The tear sat in the flames without burning. They dropped it into lava, but it floated on the surface. They buried it beneath gravel. It appeared in Mason's inventory the moment he walked away. They placed it inside a chest and broke the chest. The other items scattered across the floor, but the tear returned to his hand. At last Mason wrapped it in a shulker box and placed the box inside his ender chest. The dark droplets stayed there. "We go back to the lake," Mason said. "We build beneath stone, and we learn the rest." Steve looked west. A pale layer had spread across the horizon, hiding the trees they had crossed the previous day. The fog was moving toward their home. Chapter 4: The Mine Beneath the Lake. By the time Steve and Mason reached the village, 3 houses were missing. There were no ruins where they had stood, no piles of dropped wood, no floating doors, and no exposed foundations. Flat grass covered the places where the buildings had been, but the paths still turned toward them. Villagers gathered at the ends of those paths, murmuring at empty plots. Steve ran up the hill. Their stone house remained, though the lantern path ended halfway to the door. Beyond that point, the fence posts and lanterns had disappeared. A clean wall of fog stood at the edge of the wheat field. It did not drift like ordinary weather. Its boundary moved 1 block at a time. Each time it advanced, crops, fence, and soil vanished inside it. When the fog withdrew, plain dirt remained. Mason opened a chest in the storage room. Their labeled signs had become blank. The map above Steve's bed showed a white square spreading from the southeast. "The tape was right," Steve said. "It removes things." "Only placed blocks so far." As if answering him, a sheep walked into the fog. Its shape faded. The animal did not make a sound. When the pale layer moved onward, nothing came out. Mason sealed the ender chest inside obsidian. Steve led the villagers into the largest stone building and repaired the iron golem with ingots. They rang the bell, gathered food, and moved every bed underground. The storage room beneath their house became a bunker. Mason expanded it into 3 chambers. The first held supplies, the second held beds and villagers, the third contained the recorder, an enchanting table, and an obsidian enclosure for the tear. They replaced the escape tunnel with a flooded passage leading beneath the lake. At its far end, a bubble column rose to a small island. If the man entered the bunker, they could reach the water without opening a door. For 2 days, the fog stopped at the wheat field. Steve mined deep slate and reinforced the ceilings. Mason tested traps using pistons, lava dispensers, and powdered snow. They built iron golems in the lower halls and placed boats at corners, hoping the hunter might become caught like an ordinary mob. On the 3rd afternoon, Steve found a second cassette inside the recorder. Its label read Cassette 2, Before the Fog. No one had placed it there. He waited for Mason, then pressed the red button. The first voice returned, weaker than before. We thought the creature made the fog. We were wrong. The creature is what the fog makes when it needs hands. Static cracked between each sentence. A world remembers every block changed by a player, every tree cut, every tunnel opened, every bed claimed. The fog feeds on those changes. It returns the world to an empty seed, one block at a time. The watcher chooses where it begins. The hunter opens the shelter. The fog enters after him. Steve looked toward the obsidian enclosure. The tear is a piece of that memory made solid. It can preserve what the fog would erase. It can also mark the player who carries it. If you have found one, do not bring it to your spawn. Mason stopped the tape. The silence that followed was worse than the recording. My end chest is beside our beds, he said. They ran to the second chamber. The obsidian casing was intact. The ender chest inside was open. The purple interior contained no tear. A thin trail of fog crossed the floor from the chest to the nearest red bed. The bed vanished as Steve watched. The world shook. Every torch in the bunker went out. Villagers cried out in the dark. The iron golems turned toward the staircase. Then came the whistle. It echoed through stone from no single direction. One note sounded above them, another below, and a third from inside the walls. Mason relit a torch. Find him. Steve ran into the supply room and checked the narrow observation slit. Fog filled the wheat field outside. No white eyes appeared within it. The first iron door bent inward. Metal did not break as wood had. It folded out of its frame and vanished into the pale air beyond. The two iron golems advanced. Red eyes opened in the stairwell. The hunter entered the bunker. The first golem struck it and launched it into the ceiling. Mason activated the lava dispensers. Orange streams poured across the passage. The second golem attacked. For a moment the plan worked. The hunter burned between them, flashing red as iron arms hammered its narrow body. Then the creature stood upright inside the lava. It seized the first golem by the head and threw it into the supply chests. Wood broke. Items scattered over the floor. Fog rolled through the open stairwell and touched them. Diamonds, food, armor, and tools disappeared without the sound of burning. "Water tunnel," Steve shouted. Mason pulled the emergency lever. Pistons sealed the passage behind the villagers. Steve opened the trapdoor to the flooded escape route and pushed the first villager in. The current carried it toward the lake. One by one, the others followed. The hunter tore the second golem apart. Steve fired an arrow to draw it away from Mason. The creature turned, eyes burning. Mason placed a boat in the doorway. The hunter stepped into it for half a heartbeat, then broke the boat and the surrounding stone together. They retreated toward the water tunnel. The recorder started playing by itself in the third chamber. The voice on cassette 2 shouted through the static. "If he reaches the spawn, do not die. The world will not know where to return you." The hunter struck Mason from behind. His armor absorbed most of the blow, but he flew into the enchanting table. The block broke. Bookshelves vanished as fog crossed the room. Steve attacked with his diamond axe, landing 2 critical hits. The hunter recoiled. mouth opening around a burst of white noise. Mason drank the strong healing potion from the cultist's chest and reached the trapdoor. "Go," Steve told him. Together, they jumped into the water as the creature lunged. The tunnel was 1 block high and completely submerged. Steve swam behind Mason, watching his air bubbles decrease. Fog entered the water behind them, spreading in pale cubes. Wherever it passed, the stone lining disappeared and dark natural caves opened on either side. Halfway to the island, the passage split. It had not split when they built it. The current pulled Mason left. Steve was pulled right. He reached for Mason's boot, missed, and struck the wall. The hunter entered the tunnel behind them, crawling through water with its arms stretched forward. "Meet at the island," Mason's voice broke through the channel. Steve followed the right passage. His bubbles dropped to 3. He placed a door, but the block disappeared before it could create air. He used his pickaxe and dug upward. Stone broke into gravel. Gravel fell around him. 1 bubble remained. Steve placed a torch against the wall. The falling gravel popped into items, giving him room to rise. He broke through the lake bed and surfaced beneath the stars. The island stood 40 blocks away. No one was on it. Mason? Only static answered. Steve swam toward shore. Behind him, something broke the surface. He did not turn. The cassette instructions fought against every instinct. Find him, keep him in view. But the darkness effect had returned, and he could barely see the nearest reeds. He reached shallow water and looked back. The hunter stood upright on the lake. Not in it, on it. Its long feet touched the surface without sinking. Fog spread beneath them in a widening square. The water disappeared where the fog passed, revealing empty air and the lake bed below. Fish fell through the gaps. The lake drained into caves that had not existed moments earlier. Steve ran toward the village. The hunter followed. The chase crossed the lantern road, though only 2 lanterns remained. Steve passed the repaired stone house and the empty plots. Villagers gathered around the bell with the iron golem. Their beds had vanished in the bunker, and night offered no place to hide them. Steve rang the bell. Every villager ran indoors. The hunter climbed over the village wall. The iron golem met it beside the well. Steve did not wait to see the result. He entered the cartographer's house, climbed through a roof hatch, and crossed the rooftops while the creature searched below. Blocks began disappearing behind him. The cartographer's table, a chest, the ladder, then whole sections of roof. Steve jumped to the blacksmith's chimney and looked down. The hunter was gone. Fog filled the street. "Mason, answer me." The chat displayed a message. Mason left the game. Steve stared at the words until a breaking block forced him to move. He jumped from the roof into a hay bale, rolled and ran east along the old road. Fog erased the village behind him. The bell rang until the block supporting it vanished. Then the sound cut off halfway through a note. He ran past the plains, through the birch forest, and toward the windowless cultist house. The chase should have ended after 50 seconds, but the hunter did not vanish. The fog had touched Steve's spawn. The ordinary limits no longer seemed to apply. The dark oak structure appeared ahead. Its door stood open. The robed villager waited inside beside the empty chest. Steve crossed the threshold and blocked the entrance with deep slate. The villager looked at his empty hands, then pointed toward the floor. The scratches around the center were not random circles. They formed a pattern, a book, a droplet, and a figure standing over both. Steve remembered the ordinary book Mason had taken from the chest. It was still in Steve's inventory. He held it. The robed villager nodded. Outside, the hunter struck the wall. Steve searched the room for the tear. It was not in his inventory. It had disappeared from the ender chest. The ritual could not work without it, whatever the ritual was meant to do. The wall broke inward. Fog poured through the opening. The villager vanished the moment it touched his robe. Steve backed against the far wall, holding the book as the hunter entered. Its face lowered until the white bars of its mouth filled his view. Then a second figure crashed through the roof. Mason landed between them. His armor was gone. He had half a heart. In one hand he held an ender pearl. In the other he held the tear of the man. "Take it," he shouted. He threw the tear towards Steve and the pearl toward the open sky. The hunter swung. Mason vanished before the arm reached him. Steve caught the tear. The dark droplet burned cold in his hand. The fog stopped 1 block away, unable to cross the circle cut into the floor. The hunter stood outside the pattern, watching. Its eyes turned from red to white. The chase had ended. Steve held the creature in his view and waited for Mason to speak. No voice came. The chat remained empty. At dawn, the man vanished without lightning or sound. Fog covered everything beyond the open wall. The plains, the village, the lake, and the hilltop house were hidden inside one pale, unbroken field. Steve stepped out of the circle. The tear stayed in his hand. The book remained in the other. Far beneath the fog, where the mine had once passed under the lake, a single message appeared in chat. Mason joined the game. Then another line appeared beneath it. Mason was slain by the man from the fog. And somewhere in the white distance, Mason began to whistle.